Hello, everyone. My name is Shifat Ara, and I am the project manager for Diversity Works. I am hosting this event on behalf of CASE. CASE stands for Canadian Association for Supported Employment. For those of you not familiar with us, CASE is a national network focused on supporting our member organizations to increase employment inclusion for Canadian citizens who experience a disability. CASE is highly committed to exploring and understanding the experience of Canadian job seekers who hold multiple identities, such as BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color who experience a disability. We on increasing our collective understanding of this community's experience with supported employment in today's webinar. We have additional services to help you participate in this webinar today. Our sign language interpreters, Vanessa and Amina, will appear in a video window as part of the speaker panel. Thank you for your support today, Vanessa and Amina. Closed captioning will be available on your control panel. Please click the closed captioning button and select subtitle to turn on this feature. Just a reminder that this webinar will also be recorded. We request you to keep your cameras turned off and microphones muted. If you have a question, please click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen and type it there. We have set aside time to address many of your questions later in the webinar. However, feel free to add them at any point during the presentation. Today, led by Winnie Grant. Winnie has spent the last 30 years exploring the impact of racial trauma and the intersectionality of various forms of oppression in one's private and professional life. She employs an Afrocentric theoretical perspective and a critical race analysis in her work. With that brief introduction, I will now hand over to Winnie.
Thank you, Shafat, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this work that Diversity Works is doing. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And as we come together today, we do so acknowledging that we are privileged to be on the traditional land of Turtle Island in North America. I am presenting from my home, which is in Mi'kma'ki in Nova Scotia, which is the unceded and ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq people. As community members, we are guided by the spirit of welcome and connection to this land and its people. Also, I walk and practice in the spirit of my African Nova Scotian ancestors who have come before me and honored their legacy of brilliance and resilience, firmly rooted in over 400 years of historic and social presence. I'm ever so thankful to those that have gone before me and to those who remain among us. And I invite you to join this event in that spirit of stewardship and respect, as well as gratitude for the weather that we are experiencing today. So the title of this webinar is The Why Behind the How, broadening the discussion around diversity and becoming liberated. And so it's important to note that this is a two-part webinar and hope that you'll be able to join us for the second part, although I did hear that it was full. I always like to explain the title of workshops that I present. And in this particular case, I have decided to respond to all of the questions that I often get in the work that I do in the how. How do I do this? How do I help families? How do I help and work with diverse populations? And so what I've decided to do is to, and what I generally do when I'm speaking with folks and when they're asking the how, I ask them, why are you doing the work that you're doing? And in many roles, you know, I tell people that they are the tool. So not looking for a checklist, not looking for a different tool other than themselves to be able to do the work that they're seeking to do. And so there's an African proverb that says that I can teach you how to fish or I can give you the fish. And if I give you the fish, then you'll be able to eat for the day. If I teach you how to fish, then you'll be able to feed yourself. So not only take that lesson, but you can share it with other people. So I encourage you today to travel with me along this presentation as we critically reflect and challenge ourselves in a different way of thinking. So there is an agenda, and again, I want to welcome folks and introduce myself. I am an African Nova Scotian woman residing in Nova Scotia. I have many identities, and we'll sort of talk about identities later, but part of the identity that I have is that I am a mother, a grandmother, as well as a professor. So one of the things that we will talk about today, we will look at understanding the why, look at what is diversity, and there's a number of key terms that will assist us in moving through this discussion today around diversity and looking at the population that we are looking to work with, which is individuals living with a disability that identify as being Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And so the objective for today is to increase the awareness and provide a deeper understanding of the experiences of job seekers who identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color living with a disability. And so as we begin this work, I look at the who and the why. And so as I indicated, the population that we're talking about today are BIPOC individuals who have a disability and living with a disability. And before we move into looking at some of the terminology, I want to show you a video, and I'll ask Albert to cue up this particular video so that it gives you a better understanding as to what disability got to do with the work that we're doing. So I will turn it to you, Albert.
Welcome.
We're sure glad you're here.
All right.
Get comfortable.
Take a deep breath.
And let's imagine.
What comes to mind when you think of the word identity?
Female.
Hispanic.
Buddhist.
Transgender.
Things that help us understand who we are and where we come from.
African American.
Gay.
Asian.
Muslim.
Indigenous.
The way you think about yourself, the way you are viewed by the world.
Heterosexual Pacific Islander.
White lesbian.
Cisgender Mexican.
Black male. Were those some of the things that came to mind?
Did blind?
Or deaf.
Or lupus.
Or depression.
Or black male COVID-19 long hauler?
Or white lesbian wheelchair user.
Or any kind of disability.
Well, for many of us, disability is an identity.
And a community and a culture.
Both a socially constructed identity
And also an identity that people choose and even celebrate.
You see, disability is a natural part of the human experience.
Not a problem to fix.
or an issue you can choose not to focus on.
So, why is it important to see it this way?
Well, 15% of the world's population is living with a disability or disabilities.
And each of those people have parents, or siblings, or children.
Disability can and does affect all of us.
It cuts across age,
race,
gender,
and ethnicity.
It's something you can be born with
or acquire
at any point in your life.
And because disability itself is hugely diverse,
there are infinite ways in which we live and experience the world.
We often talk about the importance of bringing your whole self to the table.
But what happens when part of who we are is less welcome?
When we value people without disabilities over people with disabilities.
This is called ableism.
Ingrained attitudes continue to degrade and stigmatize people with disabilities.
While it's common to use language like
insane,
or lame,
or dumb,
these terms label people with disabilities as deficient and inferior
and undermine our collective work toward justice.
Now, On top of understanding the effects of ableism, there's something else it's important to know.
Although disability can affect
all of us, it does not affect all of us equally.
Inequity is exacerbated for disabled people who are members of other minority groups.
When you take racism,
add a slice of ableism,
and then some patriarchy on top,
well, then you are crushed by our systems.
So, if you were a person of color,
a woman,
incarcerated,
living in poverty,
or in more than one of those groups,
you are much more likely to have a disability.
And people of color with disabilities
are the most likely to live in poverty
and be unemployed.
But there is good news.
Everything that's wrong with our society was a set of choices. And the beautiful thing is that
together
we can make different choices.
So together,
let's take another deep breath.
And imagine.
What choices can we make to truly accelerate full inclusion?
What choices can we make to collectively dismantle ableism?
What choices can we make to fuel our march toward social justice?
There is so much.
You can
open up the conversation,
ask questions,
and listen and learn.
To move past our collective fear toward action.
You can
create a safe space for disability identity,
including your own.
You can ensure that people with disabilities are involved in decision-making and agenda setting.
You can
center the priorities of disabled people in your advocacy.
And commit both time and budget to making all your organization's activities accessible
and inclusive.
You will make mistakes.
And it's okay.
But don't let fear hold you back.
Together, we can celebrate how our differences make us stronger.
Unite us, in fact.
Together,
we can talk about what each of us contributes and honor our interdependence.
In making our systems and structures, our communities, culture, and language accessible and free from discrimination.
We won't have to imagine what a just world looks like any longer.
Because together,
we will have built it.
There is no justice without disability.
And so the importance of showing that video is that when I identified myself, I did not identify myself as a person with a diagnosed disability. And so it's important that we do hear from that population. And so the work that I will be sharing today will be work as it relates to research around BIPOC persons living with a disability. And I think it's important to share that. And so as you would have seen from the video, that there are lots of identities that individuals will subscribe to. And so when we talk about identities, it's those identities that form who we are. And we are not just singular in terms of our identities. So, earlier I identified myself as a person of African ancestry. I've identified myself as a mother. I'm not sure, but I'm a grandmother. I'm a professional, I'm a teacher. And so when we talk about diversity, we're talking about all of the variety of identities that an individual will subscribe to. And so again, thinking about diversity, diversity is about bringing people together across differences. It is not about making everyone the same. And when each of us can feel and reach our full potential, that's when diversity is working. Again, diversity is celebrating and appreciating difference. It's about understanding the unique characters and abilities of people. It's not about conforming to rules and regulations that restrict personal and professional growth. Diversity works when we're all eager to learn and to be curious and interested. Diversity is accepting, expecting, embracing, and respecting individuals' uniqueness. Diversity is not bad for business, and diversity works when a safe space is created and honesty is the starting point for all conversations. Diversity is promoting talent and not recoiling from stereotypes. Diversity is not about quotas, and diversity works when people talk and are open their minds to the great possibilities. Diversity is the very thing that brings strength and makes life beautiful, vibrant, and interesting. Diversity is not tokenism or trying to put people in harmonious silos or boxes. Diversity works when we take time to get to know the people behind what we see and are brave enough to consider the possibilities of harnessing all that potential. And diversity is everybody's business. It's not a special interest issue. And diversity works when it is embedded within our work environment, value, and it comes organically and naturally. So why behind the work that we're doing? And it's important to note that as we talked about our identities earlier, we all come with different gifts, but we all have been socialized in a Euro-Western supremacy environment. And this environment influences how we think, how we see the world, how we navigate the world. It informs our decisions consciously and unconsciously. And so when diversity works, what we're seeking to have is inclusion. And inclusion is the ability to bring our whole self to work, not just a piece of ourselves, not just showing up to fit into the organization that we are working within, but again, being able to be authentic and true to who we are as individuals. And so when we talk about the inclusion, we're talking about thoughts and ideas and perspectives that matters to individuals. We're talking about equity, making sure that constantly and consistently we are recognizing and redistributing the power within the organization. We want to make sure that the diversity, that we have multiple identities represented in an organization, and that those elements of the identity and diversity are reflective of people from all ethnic populations with varying abilities. And so what we are striving for is a sense of belonging, so that an organization that engages its full potential of the individual, where innovation thrives and views, beliefs, and values are integrated into the work. So as we talked about before, when we have inclusion, that we're able to appreciate differences, we're able to value the individual, we're able to embrace and respect the uniqueness of the individual, we're able to promote the talent, we are working in an environment which is safe and free from stereotypes, that we are able to bring our full selves to work and be able to be interested and engage and come into an environment where we know that our ideas are valued. And so part of that Eurocentric ideology talks about systemic social barriers. And it's important that we understand those barriers in terms of how they not only inform our thought process, but how it impacts our practice. And so some of the terminology that I wanted to share with us today are what's listed on the bottom. So prejudice. And prejudice is a preconceived thought that we have about individuals based on what we see. So it could be based on their disability. It could be based on their ethnicity. It could be based on whether or not they wear glasses, whether they don't wear glasses. And so again, it's a preconceived thought that we all are subjected to, right? That we are always, as a way of navigating our world, that we're sometimes unconsciously, and most times unconsciously, prejudging others. Discrimination is acting on those preconceived thoughts. And so when we discriminate, we are putting into action the thought process or the preconceived thoughts that we have about the individual that we may be thinking about, or the group of people that we may be thinking about. And so everyone is prejudiced and carries prejudicial thoughts, and everyone can enact forms of discrimination. The next is stereotype. And stereotyping is subscribing a characteristic to a particular group of people. And as we talk about individuals who have a visible disability, we may subscribe a stereotype that they're not competent, that they need pity, that they're not able to do the work as well as an able person. And so we need to be mindful that those stereotypes have an impact on the development and the well-being of the individual. The next term is racism. And I describe racism as the oppression of a race of people. And when we talk about the oppression, we're talking about prejudice, we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about elements of power, and we're talking about economic power and how it systemically works together to oppress a particular race of people. And so when we talk about racism, we talk about who can be racist. And in North America, given our social, political, and economic powers, folks who are racialized do not have the privilege or the power to oppress another racial group. We can discriminate against each other, but we do not have the ability to be racist towards each other. The other term that I like to set the stage when we're having these conversations is trauma. And I talk about trauma because sometimes we underestimate the impact that racial discrimination has upon specific populations. And we're going to talk about that a little later. But when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about the unexpected experience that happens to an individual that they have no control. And when we think about our BIPOC population and their experiences with racism, those are experiences that happen unexpectedly and can have a long-lasting emotional impact on the well-being of the individual. And so thinking about one incident of trauma and how damaging that can be, but thinking about how racism can be an everyday encounter, whether or not it is witnessed or is actually the individual is subjected to the actual act of racism, it can have a complex experience in terms of that trauma, experiencing complex levels of trauma. And so when we talk about racism, and because we know that we live in a racist society, then oftentimes what happens is that we normalize that experience. And we as people of color do not take good enough care of ourselves to be able to process those experiences. And so I wanted to share this chart with you. This is work that happened from my master's thesis. And my master's thesis was entitled The Evolution of African Consciousness, the Impact that Racism Has on Identity Formation. And so we went over the terms of stereotypes. And so some of the stereotypes that are subscribed to persons of African ancestry is that we're angry, we're violent, absent fathers, that we're poor, that we're drug dealers, that we're uneducated, that we have lots of children, that we're single mothers, that we're loud. And those are just some of the stereotypes. And that is how society depicts people of African ancestry in many, many institutions and how they're treated in those institutions. So for example, the green circular part are the institutions where racism can exist. And so it's in housing, in our education system, in employment, in social clubs, in our health system, in restaurants, in financial institutions, in transportation, in courts, through various mediums and entertainment. And so these are just many of the places where an individual of African ancestry can have an encounter with racism. And so the arrows that are there really speak to what is the impact that it would have on the individual. And so you'll see in the red circle, that those are some of the psychological impacts that it can have on an individual from an early age, from a child, even a toddler, into adulthood. And so some of those psychological responses is that it could be the person is second guessing themselves, that they're anxious, that they become depressed, they're overwhelmed with the experience, that they isolate themselves, that they feel drained and desensitized, that they have a sense of hopelessness, that they feel devalued, that they're embarrassed, that they try to conform to the dominant culture, that they internalize their experiences. And those are just some. And I think it's important to note as well that in that red circle, we as individuals, from an emotional standpoint, can experience any one of those psychological responses. So we can be anxious. You know, if we go to a new job, we're starting a new job, we can have some anxious energy as a result of the newness of it. We might feel sad because of an incident that happened in our life. We might even have self-doubt if our confidence is low based on something that we're working towards. But what's really important here to note is that this layer is a layer that happens as a result of race. And so in addition to my everyday anxiousness that I might have, I also have to think about experiences of racism that I either experience myself or that maybe my children or my partner experience. And again, that transference from that experience of racism and how it also will trigger the trauma that I have already either began to process or have processed, but it's a reminder that of the fear that oftentimes people of African ancestry and people of color, indigenous peoples, experience as a result of racism. And so when we talk about the struggle, and when we talk about racism, and when we talk about the issues that individuals living with a disability, whether they're Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, oftentimes what happens is that we tend to begin to have discussions about, is my issue bigger than the next person's issue? So as a Black person, is my race more of an issue than my disability? And oftentimes what happens is that we're asked to pick and choose which one of those abilities or issues are the prominent issue. And so what we need to understand is the impact of intersectionality, and that there isn't a single issue, and that we need to look at those issues in an intersecting way, and how when we're working with individuals, that working, we cannot just separate one from the other, that they do impact each other. So this video here will talk to us and help us to understand intersectionality.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white, and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, Black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
So you can see by that video that it's not as easy as sometimes when we talk about it. It's easier to talk about intersectionality than it is to work through all of the intersection identities that individuals may carry. And so, as you would have seen by the previous exercise of the rings that I showed, I put on this chart here just some of the oppressions and some of the institutions, as was put in the previous, and also the psychological impact. And so when we think about an individual who is racialized, who has intersecting identities, in addition to a disability, you can imagine the compounded pressures of identities and issues that they're dealing with as it relates to having a sense of belonging in the work environment that they're trying to enter into. And so again, if we had a person living with a disability that was racialized, was practicing a specific religion, traditional culture, was living within poverty, identified as a lesbian, was 63 years old, and had a disability, these would be compounded institutions that they would interface with that would again demonstrate discriminatory or racist practices, but also their compounded psychological impact for each one of those oppressions would also impact their social well-being. And so we talk about competing oppressions, and competing oppressions is also known as oppression Olympics, and the never-ending debate about who has the toughest struggle is characterized of marginalization as a competitive to determine the relative weight of the overall oppression of individuals or groups, often by comparing race, gender, socioeconomic status, or disability in order to determine who is the worst off or who is the most oppressed. And over the years, we've seen this play out quite frequently in our society. And when it was a discourse of the anti-Asian hate movement versus the Black Lives Matter movement, the gay community versus the trans community, or the visible versus invisible disabilities. And so how do some folks cope? What are some of the protective factors that individuals might use in order to fit in or to conform or to protect themselves from the emotional harm that they may experience as a result of bringing their full self to work? And so again, they may change the way that they speak. So they may hide their accent or work really hard to get rid of their accent. They may not wear traditional or cultural attire. For example, a Muslim woman may not wear hijab. They may overcompensate to hide their visible disability. They may not wear their hair in a certain hairstyle. They may change their name or where they reside when they're filling out applications. They may feel that it's their fault that they're not getting employment, that they have to work harder in order to be successful, or they may decide just to conform to Western ideals. And so we call this code switching or wearing a mask, so that the individual is almost like a chameleon when they're in the work environment because they want to fit in. They realize the importance of socializing in the work environment so that they can have those promotions that they're witnessing other folks receiving. And so we have another video, and this video is a young Black woman who talks about her experience and shares with us about her disability and how she wants to be seen as an individual. And so I'll ask Albert to cue up this video as well.
My name is Carrie Gray. Carrie Gray is a Black disabled woman, and there's power behind that. In the United States, 1 in 4 in the Black community have some type of disability, whether that's visible or invisible. Historically speaking, organizations and institutions have shown us that they want to identify with one thing and build power around that, build influence and access. And I get it, right? So this idea that you have disability rights, you have women's rights, you have LGBTQ rights, and those kind of different pockets are really building a strong narrative. But the thing that I find to be harmful is when we're not building in coalition. Because the reality is that you have people like myself who are Black, disabled, and women, and so many other things. And when you live at the intersections of all 3 of those, then you can't split your political and social dynamics between these different groups. It doesn't produce real results of freedom, and it doesn't produce real results of access to employment and other opportunities that you're looking for. I'll give one example on this. So the Black Lives Matter movement, when it was created in conjunction mostly with a lot of young folks. What was unique about this particular movement was the intersectional philosophy that was built upon. The folks getting up and saying, we are not just fighting for one narrative, but we are specifically fighting for folks who are on the margins. We are fighting for Black folks who are also LGBTQ, who are women, who are femme, who are trans, who are disabled. They named it. They saw like their people across the country and said, I'm fighting for all of you. Not just some of you, not just the ones that have traditionally gained power and access. And that gives me a lot of hope because no one wants to be left behind.
So you can see from that video that the concern is being left behind because there is a disability, being left behind because not being valued, not being seen. And so when we think about the why behind this work, the important thing is to look at how do we show up and support individuals. And so as I've mentioned that this is a 2-part webinar, part 2 will be next week, and part 2 will talk about understanding the how, which we will put in front of the why. And we will talk about using an Afrocentric lens to decolonize your Western ideology. And so I welcome the opportunity for folks, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat, and we will attempt to get to the chat and answer your inquiries as best as we can. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Winnie, for that wonderful presentation. We will spend the next few minutes going through the questions that our participants have posted in the chat box. And in the interest of time, we will pick some of the questions and Please accept our apologies if we're not able to answer yours. We already have a question from one of the participants, Katie, wondering who can be racist? Who do you think can compete and or perpetuate these ideas associated with Operation Olympics?
So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about racism, we're talking about the oppression of a race of people. So we're talking about having the ability to oppress, having the ability to discriminate at a level systemically that it impacts the policies, the procedures, and even the way society is constructed. So when we think about privilege, we're talking about the ability to navigate the system that looks like the dominant culture. And the fact that we're having this conversation around BIPOC persons living with disability, it's because diversity oftentimes is used as a buzzword. And when we use it as a buzzword, are we taking into consideration all of the needs of individuals living with a disability and the willingness to accommodate those disabilities? And so we oftentimes will want to have a diverse environment, but are we doing what we need to do to retain those individuals and to support them so that they feel part of the organization and that they feel a sense of belonging in that organization, that they feel valued in that organization, and that they can come bringing their whole selves. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about the dominant culture and not racialized. So when we think about the luxuries of being able to go to a store to get flesh color Band-Aids or stockings or personal items that are identified as flesh color, what color is flesh? And so obviously, oftentimes it's not brown. It's not, when I go and look for items I can't wear what is identified as flesh color. It's also, that ability to feel part of the organization. And when we think about organizations, oftentimes there is one person with a disability or one person that's racialized. And if you're lucky, it'll be one person who is racialized with a disability. And oftentimes when we think about that whole diversity and inclusion, are we making an intentional gesture so that the person doesn't feel that they're a special issue? So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you for that, Winnie. There's a second part to Katie's question, if you would like to add something as well, to who do you think can compete in or perpetuate these ideas associated with Operation Olympics?
So who do I think can compete? I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear the last part.
Yes, that's right. Who do you think can compete or perpetuate these ideas associated with Operation Olympics?
Okay. So I guess my first thought would be, why do we need to compete? If society was structured in a way that they welcomed and embraced diversity, then I shouldn't have to compete with somebody who has a visible diversity or an invisible diversity. I shouldn't have to compete if I need to have a cane or a wheelchair. I shouldn't have to compete with the person who may be visually impaired to the person who is not able to hear. And so if we are truly embracing diversity, then we want to be able to understand that diversity is just that, it's diverse. And so when we talk about that perpetuation, as I mentioned earlier, that we are all, when we are socialized, we are all socialized under a Euro-Western ideology. And sometimes that competitive nature tends to want to make someone feel better than the next. And so when we say who perpetuates that, I think we all perpetuate that because we all have been socialized in a way that forces us to make it. And oftentimes BIPOC folks are always, the last oftentimes to be hired. And especially if there's a disability, there's a different layer of conventional conversations that we need to have with employers to help them to support the individuals and not, and to help them to feel welcome into the space. So thank you for that question.
Thanks for answering, Winnie. We have one other question, which is, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I often hear that inclusion refers to people with disabilities. Diversity refers to people with different races, etc. Can all marginalized identities benefit from all different principles of DEI?
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for that, because I think sometimes we do, and I think it's part of that perpetuation, right? We want to say inclusion is specific to folks who may have a disability. Well, I can tell you, as a Black woman, over my course of my career, I have been included, so therefore I have been hired, but have I really been included? And so, when we're thinking about the equity and when we think about racism and the impact that racism has, it's not just, if I'm working in an environment and if I am providing a service, an employment-related service as a Black practitioner, and I'll be honest and tell you that when I did that, there was an experience when one of my clients said, I heard that if you were Black, Indigenous, or disabled, you'd have a job tomorrow. So how did you get your job? So it's that value and it's that respect in society. And again, it's part of that socialization. So that when I went to my supervisor and said, this was my experience, the response was, that person's really stressed because they're unemployed. And I get that. But in my role, I'm still responsible to provide a service. And so a better response might have been, how did that make you feel? We are here to support you. You are a valued member of our team, and I'm sorry that you've had to experience that. How do we make the place safe for people who look like me, whether I have a disability or not? And I should say whether I have a visible disability, because there are individuals who have invisible disabilities who oftentimes will keep it to themselves because of the fear. So absolutely, diversity, inclusion, and equity is critical to persons of color in the workforce on a general basis, and not just because there is a disability.
Thanks for that, Winnie. We have received another question just now from Mike. As a disability support worker, we primarily address the disability individuals live with. We as an organization have worked hard to encourage individuals to educate themselves on their BIPOC roots and their peers' BIPOC roots, because that part of them is not always recognized as it should be. As said, their disability identity is often recognized first. What are some resources and educational tools you have found useful in your teachings to encourage exploration of individuals' full identity?
Mm-hmm. Another really good question, because as I mentioned, is that, when we are working through and developing coping mechanisms to deal with racism, persons living with a disability also have to deal with coping mechanisms to live with their disability. And oftentimes what happens is that we tend to try to make the other person more comfortable with us. And so you can imagine the emotional labor that causes the individual. And so what I would encourage is that there is a need to understand all of the identities and to come to terms with, the layering of the oppressions. So recognizing that as an Indigenous person, that there are stereotypic thoughts that are subjected towards that individual because they're Indigenous. And if they're Indigenous with a disability, there's also stereotypical thoughts about disabilities. And the work oftentimes becomes ours to process. But as the employment counselor, it's incumbent upon you to understand that work as well, because we do not live day by day processing the experiences because it's normalized in society. And with that normalization, oftentimes what we will tend to hear is that, oh, they didn't really mean it. Are you sure that that really happened? I think you're a little oversensitive. So there's lots of microaggressions that happens in the workplace as well. So coping mechanisms is an absolute must. When we talk about what tools and what resources, so understanding racism, understanding intersectionality, understanding trauma and how trauma lives within our bodies and how trauma impacts the individual. And because we have those experiences, it doesn't mean that we experience them the same. So I may have the same physical disability, be of the same ethnicity, be of the same age, but I may experience it differently. And so that is what's, I think, important for individuals to realize, that there is a difference in terms of how I cope based on my experiences and other exposures.
Thank you so much for that, Winnie. We do not have any other questions at this time. So please join us if you're registered next week at the same day and time for the second part of the discussion, which is on analysis and action. And with that, we would like to close today's session. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.